I never really decided to become the villain. Um, yeah, that part just sort of happened. If you make enough money, fast enough, in the right rooms, the world stops asking how you did it and starts asking how they can stand closer to you. That's the first rule nobody writes down. You stop being a person, you become a door, a bridge, a shortcut. And once you are a shortcut, people will cross over you to get somewhere they are not supposed to be. I was good with numbers first, then with people, then with systems. I learned early that the markets were not just numbers on a screen, they were nervous systems. You apply pressure here, a reaction fires there, you whisper into one ear, and $1 billion moves silently 3 time zones away. Yeah. Once I understood that, money felt less like wealth and more like current, like electricity. But you don't really care about the beginning, do you? You want the deal, the hidden agreement, the moment where a billionaire and a government sat on opposite sides of a table and decided to protect each other from the truth. The funny thing is, it never felt like one moment to me. It was a slow, quiet slide. At first, I just hosted people. That's it. Dinners, weekends, flights, little gatherings in places most people only see in magazines. A villa here, a penthouse there, a private island that didn't show up properly on commercial booking sites. People liked that I could make problems disappear, logistical problems, personal problems, reputational problems. I wasn't the richest man in those rooms, not even close. But I was the one who seemed to know everyone, the one who could say, yeah, I think I can make that introduction, and then actually do it. Presidents, princes, CEOs, intelligence types, media stars, who built careers on exposing corruption, but still smiled a little too eagerly when the jet door closed and the cameras stayed on the ground. They all thought they were using me. The thing they never understood is that I was always watching, always listening, always connecting the dots. The night everything really shifted, nothing looked dramatic from the outside. No thunder, no flashing red lights. Just a storm that didn't quite hit, and a late landing at a small airport where the runway lights looked too dim for the jet that was rolling in. I remember the way the engines sounded as they spooled down, a kind of sigh, like even the machine was tired of carrying secrets. A senior minister stepped off first. Then a man who wasn't on the manifest, no last name on the boarding sheet, just an initial. It happens more often than you would think. Shadow guests, ghost flyers. In the car, he didn't introduce himself. Didn't need to. I had seen his face on screens big enough to drown in. He had just won an election built on rage and slogans, promising to tear down the corrupt elite. The irony was, yeah, kind of beautiful. You host interesting people, he said, staring out the tinted window. I've read fragments. The driver kept his eyes locked on the road. The minister checked his phone with exaggerated disinterest, like a man pretending he isn't sitting next to a lit bomb. I provide environments, I said. Places where people can relax, talk freely, forget that microphones exist. He smiled. Not a warm smile, not even a fake one. It was more like a calculation his face had to pass through. That's the thing about microphones, he said softly. You never really know who owns the recordings. That was the first time I realized he saw the world exactly the way I did. Later that night, after the staff melted away, after the girls were escorted to their rooms, after the last glass of expensive distraction was half finished on the table, we stood alone on the balcony. The ocean below was black, with only thin strips of reflected moonlight. I know about the investigation, he said, just like that. No preamble, no false surprise, no how are you, or isn't the view beautiful. The one you are not officially aware of? I asked. He didn't answer right away. He shrugged slightly, like a man loosening a tight jacket. Agencies talk, he said, not just to each other, to me. They don't like liabilities in key social circuits. He glanced at me, but they do like leverage. I watched his reflection in the glass. It was easier than looking at him directly. Leverage is a two-way street, I said. If I am a liability, I am also an asset. He tilted his head. Yeah, that is the theory, right? Silence stretched. The ocean breathed. Somewhere behind us, One of the generators hummed. You have tapes, he said quietly. Logs, photos, flight manifests, conversations that shouldn't have happened, at least not where you hosted them. It wasn't a question. Someone had talked. Someone who had been in a room they weren't supposed to acknowledge. People talk too much when they are safe, I said. Or when they think they are safe. Or when they are drunk, he added. Or when they are afraid, I replied. His eyes flickered at that. Just for a second. What do you want? He asked. That was the moment, that dull little investigation, some local cops, a few federal inquiries, a handful of victims with no power, became something the system itself had to negotiate with. What I want, I said slowly, is stability, continuity. I don't like chaos. Chaos is, bad for business. So you want protection, he said, from this investigation, from future ones. He turned fully toward me now. That's what everyone at your level wants when they start feeling the ground shift under their feet. I looked out at the ocean again. It was easier than admitting that he was right. I want clarity, I said. No surprises. No dramatic raids for the cameras. No sudden indictments because someone needs a distraction from their approval numbers. He laughed at that. A short, humorless sound. You really think you are that important to my approval numbers, he asked. I think I said that if certain names in my orbit were dragged into the light, it might complicate your agenda. Significantly. I didn't list the names. I didn't have to. He knew who flew where, who stayed how long, who walked into rooms where cameras weren't supposed to exist, and forgot that nothing in my world ever went completely unrecorded. You are not untouchable, he said finally. I know, I replied. People like you always think the dirt you have on others will save you, that if you fall, everyone falls. But that's not always how it works. He paused. Sometimes the system decides you are worth more dead than alive. The way he said it was so casual that my skin went cold under the island heat. And sometimes, I said quietly, the system decides it is easier to keep certain files sealed for the greater good, for national security, for the markets, for your agenda. He looked at me for a long time. Information, he said at last, is a resource, a national resource in some ways. We don't normally phrase it like that in public, but we all know it is true. He walked closer to the glass, close enough that his breath left small clouds in the cooler air. Here is the problem, he continued. If we protect you too, obviously, people notice. If we crush you too completely, they also notice. Both ways, someone asked why. Then you need a middle path, I said. Something that looks like consequence, but still preserves assets. He nodded once, very slightly. You are not the first man to put powerful people in compromising situations, he said, but you might be the first who cataloged it this obsessively. It was never meant as blackmail. I lied. He smiled again, that same calculus flickering behind his eyes. Doesn't matter what you meant, he said. What matters is how it can be used. That was the beginning of the deal. Though no one shook hands, no contract was signed, no microphone captured the words. It wasn't even one conversation. It was a series of half-finished sentences, of calls routed through intermediaries, of prosecutors suddenly softening. A month later, the tone of the investigation shifted. The questions became narrower, the language less sharp. I noticed certain charges disappear in drafts that never saw daylight. I noticed that the loudest threats became conditional. If this leaks, we will have no choice. If certain victims speak to certain outlets, we will be forced to respond differently. Always if, always leaving space. Behind closed doors, deals were floated. Not as offers, as hypothetical scenarios, reduced charges, lenient terms, nothing at the federal level, maybe something contained, local, manageable. Something that looked like punishment without actually exposing the full network. You understand, one official told my lawyer, that we have to show the public something. Oh, he understands, my lawyer replied. He just wants to know where the line is between something and everything. Meanwhile, my archives, years of recordings, logs, fragments of conversations quietly changed hands. Not all of them. Not directly. I wasn't stupid. But certain drives were copied for my own protection. Certain files were reviewed for security risks. Certain sensitive pieces of information about people who had nothing to do with me on paper, but everything to do with me in reality, were suddenly being discussed in rooms I had never entered. Information for protection. It wasn't written that way. But, yeah. Everyone knew. Of course, the protection was never absolute. I did face charges. Just not the ones that would have pried open the entire machinery. Not the ones that would have dragged those shadow guests and unnamed passengers into the witness box. The plea was narrow, the sentence curiously light, the conditions strangely flexible. Work release, 12 hours out, almost every day. A cell that felt more like an inconvenience than a reckoning. I have stayed in hotel rooms more restrictive than that facility. People who visited me during that time used to joke that it looked more like a poorly managed club membership than incarceration. The victims, they were not protected. They were not flown to islands or invited to conferences. They didn't get quiet calls from officials promising stability. They got letters they barely understood, terms that meant nothing to them, delays and postponements, and the suffocating realization that justice speaks a language they were never taught. I remember one afternoon, during that farce they called punishment, when I watched a news segment about my case. The anchor's tone was appropriately stern. The words disturbing and lenient were used. Experts shook their heads. Then they cut to footage of the president that night at a rally, shouting about how he was going to clean up sick elites. The crowd roared. They always do. Somewhere in the crowd, someone was probably wearing a hat with his name on it, bought with money from a job that would never pay enough to stand in the same room as the people he was quietly protecting. The same man who had stood on my balcony once, talking about leverage, was now yelling about law and order. He talked about monsters, predators, people like that guy. And he said it with a practiced disgust that almost made me believe he had never been within 100 miles of my world. That is how it works. They weaponize you after they are done using you. They let you become the symbol of the rot, so they can pretend the rest of the tree is healthy. Over time, rumors grew. Whispers that I had worked with intelligence services, that I had been run by one agency or another, that my parties were actually operations, that my island was wired not for personal insurance, but for national security. Half of it was nonsense. The other half was, complicated. I can tell you this much. Men in dark suits who never showed up in the guest list did come knocking. They didn't care about the girls. Not directly. They cared about patterns, about who visited right before a major economic decision, about who dropped by during tense diplomatic standoffs, about who requested private time with which foreign official, and what their body language looked like when they walked out. They never said, "We will protect you if you give us this." They didn't have to. It was implied in their patience, in their decision not to push certain questions too hard. One night, long before the investigation became public, a man from one of those nameless departments sat across from me in a room with no windows. "You put yourself in a dangerous position," he said calmly. "You have created dependencies." He slid a small folder onto the table. Inside were photos I hadn't taken, emails I hadn't seen, surveillance angles I would never have noticed on my own. I wasn't the only watcher at my parties. "You think you are the only one collecting leverage?" he asked. I looked at the folder, at the time stamps, at the careful blocks where details were erased. "What happens if I step out of line?" I asked. He shrugged. "You won't," he said. "That's why we are talking like this, and not differently." Another non-deal. Another unspoken agreement. They used my orbit to map vulnerabilities. Political, financial, personal. They built models out of my depravity and my hospitality. I knew it, they knew I knew it. And somewhere, above all of us, people made decisions about what to do with that knowledge. You can call it a trade, protection for information, contain damage in exchange for access to a living archive of the powerful at their weakest and most unguarded. You can also call it what it really was, a pact of mutual cowardice. They didn't want to face what it would mean to expose all of it, to admit how many officials, businessmen, and defenders of family values had walked freely through my doors, to explain why their own agencies had looked away so many times. I didn't want to face the full weight of what I had done, stripped of the insulation of wealth and connections. So we all did what fragile, frightened systems always do. We negotiated reality. We wrote a version of events that contained just enough outrage to keep the public satisfied and just enough omissions to keep the machine running. Of course, the machine doesn't always stay in tune. Leaks happen. A witness remembers something they were supposed to forget. A file gets misplaced. A journalist refuses to be bought. A judge decides their conscience is louder than their ambition. The second wave of exposure, the one that came later, uglier, harder to control, was less like a negotiation and more like a dam cracking. Suddenly, names that had been carefully hidden in sealed documents started surfacing. Flight logs got published. Photo archives were combed through by millions of eyes online. The president's team scrambled. The agency scrambled. Lawyers worked overtime trying to redefine what had been known and unknown in earlier agreements. They tried to draw a circle around me and say, this is where it ends. But information does not respect circles. It leaks in straight lines. In the end, the protection they offered wasn't enough to save me. It was never meant to be permanent. It was meant to buy time. For them, for me, for the illusion of order. When the time ran out, when the scandal became too loud, the system chose self-preservation. And I became expendable. You can spin my final disappearance however you want. A convenient suicide in a place where cameras mysteriously failed and guards forgot how to do their jobs. An elimination orchestrated in shadows by men who had smiled on my balcony years before, now deciding the files were safer without the man who knew how to read them. Or just a broken, cornered predator choosing the only exit he thought he still controlled. Truth is, you are never going to get a version that satisfies everyone. Half the world will always believe I was taken out. The other half will say I finally did something that resembled justice, even if it was selfish and incomplete. What matters isn't how I left. What matters is what stayed behind. Those agreements, those half-spoken trades between wealth and power, didn't die with me. The agencies that used my orbit to map corruption still exist. The politicians who brushed up against my world still make speeches about morality. The prosecutors who chose containment over exposure are still called Your Honor in courtrooms. They all want my story to function as a closed loop, a cautionary tale, a way to say, we caught the monster, the system works, move on. But listen carefully to that phrase you started with. A hidden agreement between a billionaire and a government. Protection traded for information and resources. You think that is rare? That is the template. Every time a corporation pays a fine, instead of admitting guilt, a version of that agreement is playing out. Every time a whistleblower disappears into a settlement, a quieter version of my negotiations is echoing in the background. Every time a scandal ends with one neatly packaged villain while everyone else walks away, that's the same deal, just with cheaper champagne. My life was a grotesque, concentrated version of a pattern that runs through modern power like a second bloodstream. And now here you are, listening to a dead man's ghost, trying to extract some neat lesson, some moral closing line that will let you feel like you have understood something important. So here it is. I was not saved by my secrets. I was rented by them. My information bought me time, not redemption. My connections bought me a softer landing, not a different gravity. The government didn't ally with me. It used me as a buffer between what the public could handle and what would have shattered their carefully managed illusion of order. In return, I got just enough protection to keep going until I was more trouble than I was worth. That is the real nature of the hidden deal, not an oath of loyalty, a countdown. And when you walk past the towers where men like me used to live, when you see the motorcades and the rallies and the smiling faces on screens, you should remember one thing. Somewhere, in some locked room, there is always someone sitting across from power saying, yeah, I think we can make an arrangement. And somewhere else, there is always someone like you hoping that arrangement has nothing to do with your life. It does, you just have not seen the terms yet.